In 1973, Augusto Pinochet seized power in Chile. Economists called what followed the Chilean miracle. GDP growth, foreign investment, free markets, a dictatorship that made a country rich. In 1999, Vladimir Putin came to power in Russia. Oil revenues flooded the economy. The middle class grew. Moscow became one of the most expensive cities in the world. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping consolidated control in China. What followed was the fastest sustained economic growth in human history. 800 million people lifted out of poverty. 3 autocracies, 3 economic booms. Here is what they don't tell you. A landmark study comparing satellite images to official GDP figures found that autocracies overstate their economic growth by approximately 35%. The boom looks bigger than it is, and the bust, when it comes, is always bigger than anyone predicted. Because autocracy doesn't just shape economies, it distorts them, quietly, systematically, until the distortion becomes the system itself. And then the system collapses. To understand why autocracies fail, you first need to understand why they succeed. And they do succeed, at least initially, at least on paper. An autocracy can, with the backing of the military, credibly commit to transition policies, including the power to stay with those policies through the transition downturn. An elected government that imposes painful economic reforms risks being voted out before those reforms pay off. A dictator faces no such constraint. This is the autocracy's genuine economic advantage, not wisdom, not competence, speed, and commitment. When Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew decided to build a financial center from scratch, he didn't need a decade of parliamentary debate. He decided. It happened. When South Korea's Park Chung-hee decided to build an export-led industrial economy, he didn't need consensus. He imposed it. The results were extraordinary. Countries such as China, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the United Arab Emirates are often used to support the argument that some top-down regimes may play a critical role in economic growth, autocracies with good leaders that produce good economic outcomes despite constraining civil liberties. But the argument is seductive, and it contains genuine truth. But it contains a hidden assumption so dangerous that most people never notice it. The assumption is this, that the autocrat is economically benevolent, that the dictator wants growth for the country rather than wealth for himself, that the leader with unconstrained power will choose to use that power in the public interest. The preference for growth by the economically benevolent autocrat is crucially supported by assurances that economic actors will be able to keep the fruits of their investment. The moment those assurances disappear, the moment the autocrat decides his personal interests matter more than economic growth, the advantage reverses. And history shows us with brutal consistency exactly when that moment arrives. I need to stop here for a second. If you're still watching, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Someone who wants to understand how systems actually work, not the version that gets repeated in headlines. If this is useful, a like, a comment, finishing the video, it genuinely changes what the algorithm does with this content. And if you have a view on this, which autocracy do you think had the best economic record? Which had the worst? Drop it in the comments. I read everything. Now, let's finish this. The Chilean miracle is perhaps the most cited example of autocracy producing prosperity. Chicago school economists, free market reforms, GDP growth that was the envy of Latin America. But here is what the data actually shows. Chilean income per capita greatly underperformed for at least the first 15 years after Pinochet's coup, relative to a synthetic control of countries with similar characteristics. The evidence suggests that Chile's remarkable economic growth during the period 1985 to 1997 did not depend on Pinochet's autocracy. Read that again. The Chilean miracle happened despite Pinochet, not because of him. The economic foundations were laid during the democratic period. The growth came after the dictatorship loosened its grip on economic management. And the social cost, the disappearances, the torture, the destroyed institutions, compounded in ways that the GDP figures never captured. Singapore, under Lee Kuan Yew, the exception that proves the rule. Singapore is the genuine case for benevolent autocracy. Lee Kuan Yew built institutions rather than destroying them. He constrained corruption with the same iron hand he used to constrain political opposition. He invested in human capital, infrastructure, and rule of law simultaneously. The result was genuinely extraordinary. A city-state with no natural resources became one of the wealthiest places on earth. But Singapore works as an argument for autocracy if you ignore two critical facts. First, Lee Kuan Yew was exceptional. The autocracy's ability to credibly commit was crucially supported by the regime leaders having different ambitions. Through sheer luck, they chose to pursue non-pecuniary private benefits. Luck. The entire argument for autocracy rests on the autocrat being lucky enough to be virtuous. Second, Singapore is a city, not a country. The governance challenges of 5 million people in a single urban area are categorically different from those of a continental nation with hundreds of millions of citizens spread across diverse interests. Russia under Putin, the autocracy trap in real time. Russia is the most important case study of our era because it shows the full autocracy life cycle playing out in a single generation. Russia decreased its private ownership of oil from 90% to 50% while transitioning to a more authoritarian model under Putin's leadership. The early Putin years produced genuine growth, oil revenues, stability after the chaos of the 1990s, a middle class that had never existed in Soviet times. Russians' real incomes rose dramatically. Putin's popularity was genuine and earned. But the mechanism of autocracy was already doing its destructive work beneath the surface. Where power is highly concentrated, particularly in regimes like Putin's Russia, where institutional constraints have been systematically dismantled, economic outcomes may suffer significantly. Property rights became insecure for anyone the Kremlin decided to target. Investment decisions were distorted by political considerations. The most talented Russians began leaving, the brain drain that autocracies always produce when uncertainty replaces the rule of law. The boom was real, the foundation was hollow. Every autocratic economic boom contains the mechanism of its own destruction. Here is how the trap works. Phase 1, the consolidation phase. When an autocrat takes power, the first economic priority is the same everywhere. Control the commanding heights, seize the energy sector, take the banks, nationalize strategic industries, or hand them to loyal allies. This is presented as economic nationalism. In reality, it is the conversion of national assets into political currency. The oil company, the steel mill, the television network, these are not managed for profit, they are managed for power. In the short term, this looks like strength. The state appears to control its own destiny. Phase 2, the growth phase. The stability that autocracy provides, even brutal stability, can attract investment and enable growth. Infrastructure gets built, corruption gets managed at a level where it doesn't prevent economic activity, it just taxes it. The economy grows because the baseline was low and the global environment is favorable. This is the phase that generates the miracle narrative. Foreign investors see growth, economists write papers, the autocrat claims credit. Phase 3. The extraction phase. Their personal enrichment is obscene. In the middle of an economic or financial crisis, they are incapable of restoring stability. Their ideology ignores science, facts, and proof by pretending that the enemy is abroad. Wikipedia. Every autocracy eventually reaches the extraction phase. The leader's inner circle has grown, their demands have grown, the institutions that once constrained corruption have been dismantled to protect the leader's power. And now those institutions are gone, which means the corruption they would have constrained has no limit. Investment dries up, the most capable citizens leave, the economy becomes dependent on a single commodity or a single patron, and the GDP figures? GDP growth rates are inflated by a factor of between 1.15 and 1.3 in the most authoritarian regimes. The manipulation is larger when the incentive to exaggerate economic performance is stronger, in years of low growth, before elections, or after becoming ineligible for foreign aid. Princeton University. The numbers look better than the reality, until the gap between the numbers and the reality becomes impossible to hide. Phase 4. The collapse. When the collapse comes, it comes fast. Venezuela had the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Hugo Chavez nationalized them and distributed the revenues as political patronage. By 2019, Venezuelans were leaving by the millions. Inflation exceeded 1,000,000%, and a country that should have been wealthy was in humanitarian crisis. Zimbabwe, under Mugabe, destroyed one of Africa's most productive agricultural economies through land seizures that were politically motivated and economically catastrophic. Inflation reached 89 sextillion%. The currency became worthless. The effects of autocratic transitions come in all shapes and sizes. Negative effects tend to get worse over time, and African countries are badly affected by the autocratic transition, possibly because of a resource curse. GreekReporter.com. The pattern is not inevitable, but it is consistent. Consistent enough that the question is not whether an autocratic economy will face this trajectory. The question is how long the boom phase lasts before the extraction phase consumes it. The 20th century autocrat was easy to identify: military uniform, show trials, obvious repression. The 21st century autocrat is harder to see. A new form of autocracy has emerged that is better adapted to a world of open borders, international media, and knowledge-based economies. In the Peru of Alberto Fujimori, the Hungary of Viktor Orban, and the Russia of Vladimir Putin, illiberal leaders have managed to remove almost all constraints on their power while using relatively little repression, the history of Byzantium. The new autocrat doesn't need a firing squad. He needs a compliant judiciary, a captured media, and a business community that understands which side of the political line it must stand on to remain in business. The economic consequences are the same, but they arrive more slowly, more subtly, and are harder to reverse precisely because the institutions that would reverse them have been hollowed out rather than abolished. The critical distinction may not be between democracy and autocracy, but institutionalized and personalized rule. Democracies and institutionalized autocracies may support growth through credible institutions, policy stability, and checks on executive power. But where power is highly concentrated, economic outcomes suffer significantly. EBSCO. This is the most important finding in the entire literature on autocracy and economics. It is not the label that matters, it is the constraint. And democracy without institutional constraints can produce autocratic economic outcomes. And autocracy with genuine institutional constraints, a truly independent central bank, enforceable property rights, a bureaucracy that operates by rules rather than political loyalty, can produce relatively good economic outcomes. What destroys economies is not the absence of elections, it is the absence of constraints on whoever holds power. And autocracy, by definition, removes those constraints. That is its appeal. That is also its fatal flaw. So, do dictators make countries rich? Sometimes, temporarily, under specific conditions that cannot be planned for and cannot be guaranteed. The autocracy advantage is real, but it is borrowed. It trades long-term institutional resilience for short-term decisiveness. It trades the unpredictable inefficiency of democracy for the predictable efficiency of concentrated power. And concentrated power has a universal tendency. It concentrates further. The institutions that constrain it are dismantled because they constrain it. The people who challenge it are removed because they challenge it. The information that contradicts it is suppressed because it contradicts it. Until the leader is making decisions with no accurate information, no institutional check, no political competition, and no honest advisor willing to tell him the truth. At that point, the economy is being managed by a single person's ego, and single persons' egos, however capable, are not adequate to manage the complexity of a modern economy. The Soviet Union collapsed not because socialism failed as an economic theory. It collapsed because the leaders at the top of the system had spent decades removing every mechanism that would have told them the truth about how the system was actually performing. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late to fix it. That is the autocracy trap. Not that dictators are evil, some are. Not that they want their countries to fail, most don't, but that the system they build, the system that gives them their power, systematically destroys the information, the institutions, and the constraints that any economy needs to correct its mistakes. And economies that cannot correct their mistakes don't recover. They collapse.